All right. Hello and welcome to episode 16 of Diabetics for Diabetics Radio. My name is Bowie Madison. I am your host. I am here today to talk about the past and the future of diabetes and how things need to change and my ideas about how that can come about. So it's going to be a quick look back at how we got to where we are and how I have come across some alternative explanations for how we got there. If you don't know me, my name is Bowie. I have had type 1 diabetes for over 21 years. I am healing naturally via the methods that we're going to cover today, and I'm sharing information as I go. So this all started as a personal project basically my whole life as someone with type 1 diabetes, but it really started to catch fire about 2 years ago when I really started to dive into the research, get interested in supplementation, addressing mineral imbalance, iron overload, and my results have spoken for themselves. I've never been healthier. My diabetic metrics, A1C, energy levels, overall health have never been better, and it's time to share. So here I am, here we are. Let's talk about what's wrong with our current outlook on diabetes. Now, a lot of the stuff I'm going to talk about here, I have covered in previous podcasts. So this, for the purpose of this episode, this is going to be kind of a breeze over. If you're unsure or you're interested in more, I have covered this before in some of the earlier episodes. So this is basically a summary of what we have come to see diabetes as. It's an autoimmune condition, right? So our immune system went rogue, attacked our beta cells, and cost us our ability to metabolize glucose, which is why we villainize sugar. Sugar is a diabetic's worst enemy because we have no means of getting it into the cell. And if our blood sugar is elevated for a prolonged period of time, it leads to a litany of secondary complications from hyperglycemia. Now, I have type 1. I'm going to refer to type 1 and type 2 as kind of a collective diabetes. I know that they present differently. I have covered why I think they are similar in a previous episode before. So I'm going to say it has links to obesity. You know I'm talking about type 1. Type 1 does not. Obesity has a link to type 2. So talking about fat gain, right? Body mass, total body fat, and how that is a factor in the development of diabetes for type 1 and a little bit for type 2 as well. Is it genetic? That's kind of what we've been sold as type 1 diabetics for a long time. It's just like, well, you kind of lost the genetic lottery. You have these genes and that's how the cookie crumbles. Now, I've also done a previous episode on why that's not true either. So we've come to just be managing isolated symptoms, right? So if your A1C is good, life is good, and, that's kind of like the primary metric of how you are doing as a diabetic. Plenty of type 2 diabetics experiencing advanced complications, neuropathy, kidney failure, heart disease, some sort of other autoimmune disorder. It's very rare to find someone with just one autoimmune condition. And we're basically playing whack-a-mole with all of these new things coming up. So we're really just managing symptoms, isolated symptoms, without a true understanding and a true evaluation of the system as a whole and where this disease comes into play. And no one's getting better, right? The rate of diabetes continues to go up, type 1 and type 2. Type 1, which used to be strictly for youth and children has now started to develop later in life. People in their 20s, 30s, 40s getting type 1 diabetes. People with type 2 diabetes becoming insulin dependent and having that become type 1.5 or LADA, late adult onset diabetes. And the straight conversion of type 2 to type 1, right? So over time, it has shown to be truly a spectrum of altered glucose metabolism, with type 1 being all the way over where we've lost our ability to effectively manage our blood sugar to stay alive. Type 2 is somewhere in between with all of the myriad of complications. So if you have unmanaged type 2, you're in for a ride, because all of the conditions and comorbidities are getting worse and worse and worse and worse. Medication list grows and grows and grows and grows. And we have to ask ourselves, what's happening? Who are we supposed to turn to, right? You're a type 2 diabetic. You get medications for type 2 diabetes. You do your best with what you have. You end up with chronic kidney disease or neuropathy or restless leg syndrome or IBS or Crohn's. So you're just like, the wheels start coming off. And it's clear that the current medical system, the way it is operating, managing symptoms, does not have the whole picture, right? We're not getting better. No one's healing. I don't think there's any debate on that. The research that medicine is using to develop treatments is so slow to unfold. It is subject to approval. It's subject to the biases of the people asking for grants. Again, it needs to be profitable. So if it needs to be able to put into a pill and sold, the funding, approval, human trials, accessibility, affordability, the correlation between what's found in animal trials and does it translate to human trials. It takes years. It takes years. And I have had diabetes for 20 years. And so when I was diagnosed in 2001, I got the speech of, well, you got it at a great time. There's a lot of new great research coming out. It shouldn't be long before stem cells, transplants, technology really kind of makes this obsolete. And people who are being diagnosed today are getting that same exact speech. What's changing? We're not making any progress. Or if we are, we're not forthcoming with it. So it's kind of, it's worth those with diabetes planting our feet, taking a hold of this, taking kind of inventory of what we have, where we are, and what we're doing, and how we can make it better. So type 1, as we currently see it, genetic predisposition, right? We have a certain combination of genes that made us more likely to develop altered glucose metabolism. Again, I don't think it's true, but that's how we kind of accept it in the mainstream. Inflammation of unknown source. So we're inflamed, right? We've got all the signs for it. Beta cell death, altered glucose metabolism, a lot of other autoimmune conditions that come with being diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. I was also diagnosed with celiac disease. We don't know why. It's just inflammation, this blanket statement, without actually understanding its source. Unique to type 1 is that there are no dietary restrictions after diagnosis. There's no modification to diet, nothing to watch out for. You know, as long as you've got your insulin pump, you've got your insulin or your injections, you know, eat like you normally would, eat like a healthy person, and things should be okay without any investigation into the content of the food that you were eating as you develop the disease, which is just beyond me. For type 1, your beta cell mass is below the critical threshold of sustaining life. They are lost and they are gone forever. The rate of beta cell growth in a typical human is so slow after childhood, early childhood, that there's no hope for it to get to a point where you will be able to sustain life and you won't be insulin dependent, right? And not to mention, we're not actually addressing any of the inflammation that brought about the condition in the first place. So we're left hoping on stem cells and pancreatic transplants as our only means of restoring full function. That, which I also think is a load of shit, because again, if you're not addressing the main source of inflammation, what are the things that you can do for those new stem cells and pancreatic transplants that are going to prevent it from happening all over again? No answer for that. Again, the success rate of pancreatic transplants is incredibly low. For those that are successful, nobody talks about it. There's no follow-up. There's no how are they doing? Did it stay that way? Is it viable for other people? It happens once, it's celebrated, and then it's stowed away for never to be seen again. And then type 2, also a possible genetic predisposition. Again, the joke goes, if type 2 diabetes runs in your family, it's the only thing that's running in your family because of the association of type 2 diabetes with poor diet and a lack of exercise. Because obesity is seen as a risk factor. High fat, high processed greens, high sugar intake, those are all things that are conducive to putting on body fat, which is believed to be the precursor to developing diabetes. So the dietary advice: limit sugar intake, improve your diet, and get moving, right? And they have achieved reversals and remissions of type 2 diabetes, right? Through diet and exercise, weight reduction surgery. I know people who have reversed their type 2 diabetes doing keto. I know those that have done it losing weight. But again, just like type 1, it's all born of inflammation leading to that insulin desensitization or resistance and all of the complications that come after that. Now, I want to preface all of this, right? I need you to forget everything that you think you know about diabetes and come in here with an open mind, which if you're a subscriber, I assume that you already are, because I'm kind of going against the grain a little bit in some of my logic in this. Just hang in there. Let's see what we can think of. So I think what I agree with in both cases of type 1 and type 2 is that it is born of inflammation. Okay, so we're going to assume that both type 1 and type 2 are truly inflammation based. Type 1 had their beta cells, quote unquote, destroyed by the immune system. Type 2 had their insulin receptors altered, the circulation of insulin decreased, and they may also have compromised beta cell mass. Okay, so that's another feature that a lot of type 2 diabetics aren't paying attention to. But the question at the heart of it all is, what is causing this inflammation? Where is it coming from and why? And how does that play into the currently accepted explanations for the disease itself and all of the complications afterwards? Iron overload is the thing that I have found that fits the bill on the most levels of where the inflammation comes from, as well as the complications once the disease develops. Every step of the way, there is documented effects in the scientific literature of how this happened. Logically, it makes sense. No one in the greater research community has yet to put all of the pieces together. That's what I'm here to do. Okay, so iron overload is a ubiquitous source of systemic inflammation. Documented inflammatory effects of iron overload: an overloaded iron recycling system, a depleted mineral balance, minerals being the things that keep everything in check. When they become imbalanced, cells start to dysfunction. Okay, so iron is easily traced via our diet and nutrition. Enriched grains have been added to corn, wheat, every grain, every baked good, every commercial cereal, dough, flour has had iron added to it without any regard for any of the supporting minerals that help iron do what it needs to do. And when iron isn't balanced and can't do what it needs to do, it becomes dangerous, right? And there are documented and researched effects that are specific to diabetes. I'm talking beta cell death, insulin resistance, hyperinsulinemia, excess fat storage, and then a litany of endocrine and digestive dysfunction downstream of the overloaded cell. So this is just one of the papers, and I am not one to find a paper that says what I like and then just use that as my only source. This is one example of many connecting altered iron metabolism and altered glucose metabolism. Okay. So we talked about it in the previous episode, actually, on how iron affects the pancreas. Beta cells are unique in the pancreas in that they have a protein called hepcidin, which is the master iron regulator. It is determining how much iron comes into and out of the cell, and in a state of iron overload, the way it acts and the way its safety mechanisms are set up, in times of inflammation, it locks iron in the cell. Because like we mentioned before, iron is a pro-oxidant. It makes inflammation worse when it is not bound the way it needs to be bound. Now, typically this is a good thing, right? If you have like a bacterial or a viral infection where you're inflamed and you're handling your immune system is handling its business, pulling iron out of the system is a good thing because you don't want that iron to make what inflammation is happening already worse. What hepcidin does not account for is if that inflammation is born of excess iron in the first place, right? So we have too much iron in our body. It is causing too much inflammation. That inflammation cues the beta cells and hepcidin to retain extra iron. Now, when you're retaining extra iron in a state of iron excess, you're making things worse. So what happens? Those beta cells are more and more subject to an immune reaction. And that's where we kind of have this idea of an autoimmune condition where our immune system attacks the beta cells, right? But if you've ever wondered, well, why just beta cells? There are lots of different cell types in the pancreas. Why are the beta cells targeted? It's because they have hepcidin. And then expanding to type 2 diabetes and all of the different factors affecting diabetics, insulin sensitivity, insulin resistance, beta cell mass. There is even more research on altered iron metabolism and diabetes as well. This is just one of those papers. So iron's a pro-oxidant, right? Pro-oxidation leads to more oxidative stress, more inflammation. Oxidative stress leads to inflammation, right? Those ROS, reactive oxygen species. This causes inhibition of insulin internalization and actions. So insulin is not able to be taken into the cell to allow glucose to come in the way it is supposed to. And if it is not able to go into the cell, what happens? It stays in the serum. That leads to hyperinsulinemia or insulin resistance. So insulin isn't able to get into the cell. That's kind of a long way to say insulin resistance. If you're insulin resistance, the insulin that's in the system starts to get overloaded. That's hyperinsulinemia. Now, free iron also exerts a positive feedback on ferritin synthesis. Ferritin is a storage protein for iron. while oxidative stress increases the release of iron from ferritin. So you have this crazy ping pong effect of iron in the system causing more ferritin to be released, taking iron from storage. The inflammation, the oxidative stress, is increasing the release of iron from ferritin, which is just like adding fuel to the fire. So this increased oxidative stress and insulin resistance cause endothelial and tissue damage, right? That's beta cells. Beta cells and their potency being affected, their mass being diminished, as well as all of the cells of the body becoming glycated. Protein glycation is basically the receptors for insulin on the cell are no longer able to bind insulin, so they're not able to do what they need to do. That's insulin resistance. So protein glycation, just like it says, as seen in diabetes, further amplifies these abnormalities, stimulating iron release from transferrin, increasing the cell oxidative, oxidative stress, and directly causing endothelial and tissue damage. Okay, so this is just a mass collapse of a system. So all of the safety mechanisms put in place to manage excess inflammation are also things that exacerbate iron dysfunction. And for diabetics, you have both. You have inflammation born of iron dysfunction. So when the inflammatory mechanisms happen, your iron dysfunction gets worse. Your iron dysfunction gets worse, you get more inflammation. You get more inflammation, your iron dysfunction gets worse. And it just collapses. It makes everything bad. So, oxidative stress goes up. Inflammation, that's bad news. That increases tissue damage all over the body. And again, it's not just limited to the pancreas. We're talking in the brain. We're talking in the heart, thyroid, pituitary, liver, gonads, gut. The list goes on and on. Increased insulin release. That's that hyperinsulinemia, right? Decreased insulin sensitivity, decreased insulin utilization, and an increase of iron release from ferritin. So there's more iron in the system. More iron leads to more oxidative stress, more tissue damage, more hyperinsulinemia. It's just bad news. So it's worth taking a look at our current understanding and how we got to where we got. Our current understanding targets fat as the culprit in insulin resistance, right? If you're obese, you are much more likely to develop diabetes. If you are obese, you're much more likely to develop non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. Non-alcoholic fatty liver disease is, you're a lot more likely to develop type 2 diabetes as well. So fat, this anti-fat agenda in the diet space, in the health space, is born of the idea that it causes insulin resistance. But is that true?
Fat and obesity have been targeted as causes for insulin resistance. And this study in particular talks about how excess adipose tissue, which is just excess fat tissue, plays a major role in affecting insulin resistance. And that's true. Fat does make insulin resistance worse. But if insulin resistance and altered glucose metabolism started before obesity and fat accumulation, right? We just assume that people are getting fat and then becoming diabetic. But if we look at the conditions of iron overload and the fact that they lead to hyperinsulinemia, wouldn't hyperinsulinemia affect body fat mass? Okay, so what can we account for the state of affairs before obesity or non-alcoholic fatty liver disease? What is something that would preferentially store fat specifically around the midsection and in the liver and pancreas, of which people with obesity, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and diabetes all have, is fatty livers fatty pancreas. Okay, what's that uniting factor? And it's insulin. They've got a lot of insulin in the system, and guess what? People with iron overload have hyperinsulinemia. They've got too much insulin in their system, and they have altered glucose metabolism so that they can't effectively use the insulin to process glucose. So you have to wonder, what is another trait of insulin other than glucose metabolism? That's fat storage. Insulin stores fat in states of excess glucose. Iron overload creates those conditions so that if there were a lot of insulin, it would prioritize fat storage. So might people be in a state of hyperinsulinemia before gaining body fat so easily? So might that be why people gain weight so much? We've come to assume people put on body fat and then develop hyperinsulinemia and insulin resistance. But iron overload opens the possibility for insulin resistance and hyperinsulinemia to happen first and exacerbate that fat loss, or fat gain rather. And that fat gain makes the diabetic condition even worse. So this is from that paper. Insulin decreases the circulating concentration of all major metabolic fuels by stimulating glucose uptake, right? That's its primary purpose. It gets the glucose into the tissue so that they can use it for energy. It's suppressing the release of fatty acids from adipose tissue, right? So it's making sure that adipose tissue accumulates, inhibiting the production of ketones in the liver, and promoting fat and glycogen deposition. Fat deposition is gaining fat. So it's putting on fat and making sure that the fat's already there stays there. Tell me that doesn't make sense. So I've got this great master chart here, kind of walking everybody through how we got here, right? So step one is the excess iron load, right? We're getting it through our diet. Enriched grains, processed foods, inflammatory oils, excess sugar, heavy metal contamination making inflammation worse, mineral depletion, all of the things that give balance to that iron recycling system. And look up, I've got an episode going over Fenton's reaction and the Haber-Weiss reaction in how inflammation occurs that make things way worse. So oxidative stress through the roof, inflammation through the roof, right? And you've got all systemic inflammation leading to tissue death, right? Beta cells have hepcidin. Hepcidin in a state of inflammation retains iron. Retaining iron makes it more susceptible to oxidative stress. Beta cells dead. And this affects the greater endocrine system, right? All of the things that the liver is connected with, which is just about everything, is affected. Insulin resistance, so altered tissue health, that protein glycation, it's unable to bind and effectively use insulin for glucose to get in the cell, right? Sensor sensitivity, impaired insulin signaling, so it's nothing is firing on all cylinders here. And then hyperinsulinemia. If it can't get into the cell, insulin's just floating in the system, right? Insulin, when it's combined with free iron, which is also in the system, it promotes more oxidative stress. So again, this is just a complete and utter failure of what was supposed to be a safety mechanism. More insulin in circulation, less glucose metabolism, that leads to increased fat storage. And with all of that free iron, all of that oxidation, ferritin is actually releasing iron into the system. Hepcidin is retaining iron from that system, causing more inflammation. And again, I'm going to go through each of these pieces. So this is all from episode 12, talking about inflammation and how Fenton's reaction and Haber-Weiss reaction take what was typically a relatively harmless hydrogen peroxide ion and turn it into a hydroxyl radical, which is basically a Tasmanian devil in the cell that is just destroying DNA, destroying proteins, making everything bad. Then we've got a little bit from episode 13 and episode 15. So all of that chronic systemic oxidative stress is just wreaking havoc on the system as a whole. Beta cells are dying off. Our liver is not functioning at full function. Thyroid is thrown off. Pituitary can be thrown off. Our gut is retaining more iron, becoming more sensitive. You've got people with IBS, Crohn's, celiac, and it's affecting our insulin resistance. It's affecting our levels of circulating hyperinsulinemia, all of which contribute to even more altered iron metabolism and even more oxidative stress. Once you have all of this systemic inflammation and all of its results for an extended period of time, you've got a ton of body fat, right? Because you haven't changed your diet, you have all of that circulating insulin, and you're not able to effectively use it to metabolize glucose. Increased fat storage. Increased fat storage makes your diabetic conditions worse, right? Being fat, having that excess body fat is increasing your insulin resistance, making everything happen even faster. And with the tissue death associated with that inflammation, specifically in beta cells, those beta cells, after that, they can only take an inflammatory response for so long before they actually start to die off. So decreased beta cell mass, ferroptosis is just cell death via iron. Type 1 and type 2 both have some degree of transient increase in insulin production after that initial inflammatory attack. Type 1 diabetics have the honeymoon phase, right, where they think, oh my God, maybe I'm not diabetic, but it's really just your body kind of in this last-ditch effort with what beta cells it has left. It just starts operating on overtime. Eventually, everything gets exhausted or succumbs to the inflammation there. So, press pause if you need to. Again, it's a lot of information, but this explanation turns type 2 diabetes completely upside down, right? Insulin resistance and altered glucose metabolism precede body fat accumulation. You are not getting fat and then developing diabetes. You have iron overload, which leads to inflammation, which leads to altered glucose metabolism, which leads to hyperinsulinemia, which leads to body fat storage and obesity. Okay? The obesity that results exacerbates the existing damage. We have just focused on that last little bit, obesity making things worse, but we don't actually know what caused it in the first place. Addressing iron overload, managing our iron load, and rebalancing our minerals would treat the true root cause of how this all came to be. And what about type 1, right? And I would argue that the only true difference between type 1 and type 2 is the rate at which beta cells are compromised. Type 1s, we're below the critical threshold. We cannot make enough insulin to sustain life. We are insulin dependent. Type 2 is kind of like wavering. They're like sort of have enough, but they're on the down. Type 1s, we're losing beta cells and glucose metabolism fast enough to skip out on fat accumulation and go straight to diabetic ketoacidosis. Type 2, we're losing beta cells more slowly and with more secondary complications. But if this is true, iron overload is still the reason it all happened. So I mentioned with all that business talking about stem cells and transplants not working because we can't address the initial source of inflammation. Addressing iron overload and establishing mineral balance is how a type 1 diabetic, calms the inflammation to allow for beta cells to succeed. And why? Like, why type 1 and not type 2? Why type 2 and not type 1? I'm not going to pretend to know. That could come down to a genetic predisposition, the HFE gene and hemochromatosis, and our likelihood of retaining iron. It could be a difference in inherited mineral balance, right? Because this is multi-generational. We have had 3, 4, 5 generations consuming enriched wheat flour, enriched grains, everything. So we don't just inherit genes from our ancestors, we also inherit their cellular environment. So type 1 may have just inherited a deck of cards that put them so close to that critical threshold of iron overload that it did not take long for it to manifest. But like I said before, both come down to effectively managing iron load and the resulting inflammation, right? So as a diabetic, you've watched this episode now. What am I supposed to do? You need to stop your intake of added iron. No more enriched grains, no more commercial breads, no more commercial pastas, baked goods, no processed food, anything that has reduced iron or ferrous sulfate on the ingredient list is not entering the body. Stop taking multivitamins. Multivitamins are it's basically just kind of like throw it at the wall, see what sticks. You do not need any more iron. You do not need any more iron. Same goes for iron supplementation. And I did an episode on anemia and how that fits into all of my talk about iron overload, because a lot of people with autoimmune conditions also are diagnosed with anemia. They're not truly anemic. They are anemic by means of chronic inflammation. So go watch that episode to get the lowdown on that, but you need to stop supplementing iron. And then for the iron that you do have in your system that is wreaking havoc and causing all of this systemic inflammation, you need to start offloading it and rebalancing your minerals. So blood donations, I give every 2 months. It's a great way to offload 200 to 250 milligrams of iron. You need to eat nutrient-rich foods, organic fruits and vegetables, to make sure that you're getting a well-balanced source of a litany of nutrients that are balanced in a way that are not just going to feed the existing imbalanced system that we have right now. So iron chelators are ways to make sure that iron does not take an undesired effect, right? So iron that is bound is much safer than iron that is unbound. Iron chelators are binders to iron to make sure that it's not doing something it's not supposed to. And then supplementation, right? Addressing the imbalance at the source, right? If we have too much iron, that means we have too little copper, too little of the fat-soluble vitamins, too little magnesium, sodium, potassium. So when we start to supplement those things opposite iron, it starts to balance, right? We're trying to get back to neutral. And stay tuned for more. Okay, so again, this is really just the tip of the iceberg. It's hard not to cover so many things in each episode because everything is so interconnected and related. I wrote a book documenting basically everything that I have been addressing in my own healing, called The Ironclad Cause. The link is in my description. I highly recommend it. It's been a huge project, a passion project for me, and there's really no one it can't help. So follow me on TikTok. That's where I am more often than I am on YouTube. YouTube is for this longer form content, but subscribe. There's more coming. We're gonna keep at this, keep hammering this home. There is a cure. There is a cure someplace in this. Again, I'm not going to pretend to have it right this second, but it's here. It is here, and we're going to find it. All right. So this is episode 16, Diabetics for Diabetics Radio. I'm your host, Bowie Madison. Thank you so much for being here. All of your support means the world to me. And here's to a life, a world, our health after diabetes. All right. Thanks, everybody.